We are going to have a change of topic now because we are going to deal with veterinary medicinal products, which is also in the remit of this agency, so a different type of a customer. And I'm happy to welcome my colleagues from the veterinary division, who are going to be chaired by Dr. David Mackay, who is the senior advisor in the veterinary area, and his colleagues who are going to present. But of course, you will see that we try to use as much as we can the same system for our veterinary medicines and our human medicines. No reason for most of the things to make a difference. And we really try to follow and to work together, so the vets are really part of what we do. David.
That's great.
Yes.
This is like a stage. We're just doing a very quick shift on the of personnel. So I'm here.
Okay. Yeah. So.
And who's steers this?
Yeah, it depends. Sorry, I'll try to speak in the microphone. The so David, I can change the slide for the speakers if they want. If they prefer to do it, they have the keyboard, but that's a detail.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're all settled in position here. And so, yes, now rather similar to the last presentations, we're going to give something of a smorgasbord of the activities that we undertake, a flavour of the very wide-ranging different activities that we do within the veterinary medicines division. I would find it very interesting, and it may actually help us to pitch this presentation correctly. Could people just raise their hands if their agency is involved in regulation of veterinary medicines in any way? That's great. Okay, that's kind of what we thought. Thank you very much. So for some people this will be of general interest, and for others it will have a very specific interest. And we've really prepared those slides in that way. Okay, so what we're going to do then is give a general introduction to the veterinary medicines, explain to you how we work within the agency, and then cover these specific topics that are listed here, which I'm not going to read out, but which we hope will be of general interest to you, and we'll explain the principles that I'll talk about around the way we work within the agency on the next slide. And then we will, as I say, each of these topics will be illustrated by the relevant speaker. So, Agnes has already spoken about this. I just wanted to say a few words about the approach to regulation of veterinary medicines, because we know from our colleagues within the European Medicines Network that there are very many different ways in which you can approach the regulation of veterinary medicines within a joint agency, and there are several different joint agencies across Europe. But this is the way we do it here. So first of all, I think it's important to point out that there is a specific legislative framework for veterinary medicines, which is quite similar to the human one, but is distinctly different where necessary. And in fact, it is under review at the present time, where we hope to introduce amendments to the legal framework, hopefully as early as next year, under the principle really as similar as possible, as different as necessary. And that's really the principle that we try to apply here. So within the agency, we have a division that works in a cross-agency way, but the veterinary division is specifically focused on licensing, authorization and maintenance of veterinary medicines. And that committee, that division has its own committee structure that supports it, and I think earlier this morning you heard about the CHMP and the various different committees that support human medicinal products. Well, on the veterinary side we have a single committee, which is the Committee for Veterinary Medicinal Products, and a number of working parties groups of experts that support that committee, just as there is on the human side. And you'll see that some of those are veterinary specific, such as the safety, pharmacovigilance, and some of them are joint with the human side in terms of the Quality Working Party or the 3Rs working group. Again, I'm happy to answer any questions on those, but I won't elaborate any further, just to say we follow the same model with committees and working parties. So in terms of what activities are completely shared, inspections and compliance of manufacturers, they all operate to GMP, the same quality, the same GMP applies. There are different annexes to the GMP directive for some types of veterinary medicines, but generally the compliance is run centrally. And then I think one point that we'll come back to repeatedly throughout today, and is something that you hear a lot about now, and that is the application of the One Health approach. So we try as much as possible to integrate our approach and to bring together expertise across the agency, across the agencies, that's the EU agencies, and across the wider network to tackle these human health, animal health and the environment issues together. And we can think about things like antimicrobial resistance, which we'll come back to, also flu pandemics, where sometimes vaccination of animals can reduce the likelihood of pandemics in man. Sometimes there are other zoonotic diseases where a One Health approach is very useful, and that's generally what we try to do, and you shall hear some examples throughout the rest of today. So finally, on the principles, we have our EU network strategy that lays out what are we trying to achieve as an agency, where do we want to be, and this the second strategy covered the period 2015 to 2020, and that has within it, under theme 2, a veterinary specific chapter, essentially laying out the 4 overall objectives that are here, and we're going to talk about one of them in particular, which is around increasing availability, on the top left-hand corner. Bottom left-hand corner, talking about key public and animal health priorities, including AMR, so we'll cover those in talks. But it's really to say we are integrated within the agency strategy. We have a dedicated area where we are focusing on veterinary elements, and we approach those through this One Health approach of trying to use the best resource in the most efficient way possible. So with that, I'm going to pass the microphone on to the first speaker, who is Minna Leppänen, and Minna will introduce herself and then give a short presentation. Thank you.
No, you have to go to the center so everybody can see you.
So thank you, David, and thank you for all being here. And I work currently here in the European Medicines Agency in Veterinary Division as Head of Veterinary Biologicals and Emerging Medicine Service, and part of the responsibilities in that service is innovation and early support actions. So like David already said, I will mainly concentrate on this first objective in this network strategy, so increase availability and promote development of innovative medicines, and how we actually work on that topic. And then, of course, first question is why that is such an important topic. And it's mainly because, as said, availability of veterinary medicines is a very crucial issue, not only in Europe but throughout the world. And as we see, one important tool to increase availability, of course, to support development, support innovation, so to be able to have new products on market, also to find new innovative ways to use existing products. And this illustration, it gives an overview of all support measures we have in place in veterinary medicine. Not part of them are not specific for veterinary medicines, but also working on the whole agency to support development in different phases, starting from the very early phase support that is provided for small and medium-sized enterprises. So we have here in the agency a dedicated SME office that works with those companies, and there are a registration procedure, and if company is in that SME register, those companies are eligible for certain kind of incentives and support. Innovation Task Force is another usually quite early stage support. So when developers have their first thoughts, they have their innovations, purpose is to provide a platform to discuss with the regulators, with us. That's of course something, it's not only veterinarian, it's also for the human products and human developers. But then the first very veterinary specific topic that we will handle a little bit more in detail in later is this minor use, minor species and limited market designation and incentives. Scientific advice procedures, again something common in human and veterinary science. In a little bit later stage of the development, when the developers have already a more precise view of what they plan to do, purpose is to provide advice on how they should proceed with their development plans so that they can put together a dossier that will end up in the successful authorization procedure. And then during the development, there's an option we can have pre-submission meetings, not to discuss so much scientific issues, but more regulatory procedural advice until the companies reach the application phase when they are ready to submit their application for evaluation. And as you see, these all are more company or product specific measures. So a little bit tailored, I would like to say, for each individual product and each applicant's or developer's purpose. But then we have one more general kind of overall guidance measure that was put on place in 2014 when the ad hoc expert group on veterinary novel therapies, that we usually call with the shorter name ADVENT, was started its work. And ADVENT's task is to provide overall guidance in the area of novel therapies in veterinary medicine. So this is very summarizing a little bit what comes out from those support measures. It's like I said, for novel therapies innovation, ADVENT provides guidance. We have already seen the first authorization of veterinary monoclonal antibody product. We assume that we will see some stem cell products in the near future. What has been very delightful that during these couple of years, Innovation Task Force briefing meetings has been available also on veterinary side, that we see steady increase of the requests. So last year we had 4 meetings. This year we have already 8 requests, and so we will double the amount of those meetings. Scientific advice, that's something, of course, we don't see as many requests as from the human side, but it's quite steady, 20 requests per year. And then, of course, you can ask what's the link of this support of novel therapies and innovation to human medicines, and it's actually, you can look it from the 2 angles. If looking from the veterinary medicinal angle, it's actually that we are speaking of the areas and products that are new on the veterinary medicinal, not only developers, but also to the regulators, so we can use and learn from the experience from the human side. But then on the other hand, also there's the option that there are certain things, for example, developers, they have to do certain amount of animal testing with their products before they can go to human trials. So those animal data can support the human dossiers and development of human products, but at the same time also provide opportunity to get products for animals on market at the same time. And then in more general level availability, as mentioned, and we will come in detail, is MUMS program and procedure, but then very important part and link to the human medicines, of course, is especially vaccines. And as you know, that we have quite many animal diseases that are also zoonotic infections, so vaccination of animals and developing of vaccines in that area is very critical also for human health and preventing those diseases and those zoonotic diseases to spread to the humans. So this is a summary of the actual evaluation process, and I think, like somebody mentioned earlier, the procedure for evaluation is exactly the same like in human side, starting from the eligibility of the product for the centralized procedure, and as you might have discussed, there's the certain mandatory scope and then optional scope, appointment of rapporteurs, and then submission of actual dossier. Having this three-step procedure with clock stops in between, allowing the applicant time to prepare responses, and finally ending up in veterinary side CVMP, so our committee opinion, and then finally the European Commission decision. And this is also illustrating our network. Same principle here like in the human side, that, and also a little bit about the numbers. So 2015 we received 10 initial marketing authorization applications for vet products, last year 21. And for example, we got the opinion for the first DNA vaccine for salmon and some other interesting new and innovative products. But we work with the same principle that the European network and the experts that network puts on our availability, gives us the availability on those experts who play an essential role in making the assessment and actual evaluation. So that's exactly the same like in the human side. So now we go a little bit more specific veterinary thing, minor use, minor species, and although this is veterinary specific, it's a little bit like orphan medicines in human size. So purpose is we have those major species, so pig, cattle, sheep, and then we have minor species, and purpose is to get products on market also for those species, although it's not always so attractive for developers. So we have a classification procedure. The classification is done by the CVMP, and the products that get the MUMS classification first, they get incentives regarding the data requirements, so that it's possible to submit a dossier with reduced data requirements. Also, if it's for food-producing species, there is a possibility to get financial incentives, so that might be fee reduction or waivers for fees for specific procedures. So overall purpose is to support the companies to develop also these products that have a smaller market than at some other. And of course we have additional availability support, like mentioned earlier. We have this vaccine availability initiative together with the European Regulatory Network, and one is for veterinary part specifically, then also for human veterinary part. Also there are actions that we try to keep existing products on market, and of course work all the time to explore the ways to improve availability in specific sections. For example, the aquaculture is currently very much on board and discussed, and there's a lot of interest because it's a big area. Okay.
Thank you very much. Mina, before we move on, any questions on any of that? We'll get an opportunity at the end. Yeah, there is a question at the back. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Nathalie Strup, DNDi. Is there any pharmacovigilance follow-up or activities for vet medicines?
We will cover that under a presentation that's coming up a little later. Yep, we'll cover pharmacovigilance. Yep, one more. Yeah.
Yes, Andreas Balser from Swiss Medic. I was reading, you said there were cell stem products for horses just under scrutiny just now. I wondered, is this really a medicinal product or not a transplant? Or under which legal framework do you review these products?
That's true that, of course, the current legislation and directive, when it was written, I think nobody foresees stem cell products coming, so it's not completely clear, but that has been the consensus in the committees that stem cell products fulfill the definitions of the veterinary medicinal product. And one of the things in the new legislation that David mentioned is, of course, that to get more clarity on those novel therapies and their classification, that the current legislation is unfortunately missing.
Okay, thank you. And I think then we'll move on now, because time is moving quickly, and we'll go next to one more. I see one more quick question.
Thank you. I'm Cynthia from the National Pharmaceutical Regulatory Agency of Malaysia. This is with regards to the minor use, minor species. As you mentioned, there will be incentives like a reduced data requirement. So does this mean that, for example, the applicant only needs to submit studies done on the major species and not on the minor species, or they have to give data or maybe like a pilot study done on the minor species? Thank you.
So it depends on the actual case and the product, and we have specific guidelines for the specific data requirements for safety or quality or, for example, efficacy or immunological that actually were updated just quite recently, 2016, 2017. But those are very typical cases also that what we try to propose and promote, that in case of the MUMS products, when the companies plan what they program and what studies they intend to do, it's a very good time to discuss with the scientific advice to get the joint understanding that how those data requirements in each specific case should be interpreted and what should really be necessary in the dossier.
Okay, thanks. So we're going to move on now to have a presentation from Nick Jarrett, who's going to talk about MRLs, maximum residue limits.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon. So, yeah, my name is Nick Jarrett, and I've worked here at the agency for a little over 10 years, and during that time, my area of work has been primarily on consumer safety related areas, and particularly the establishment of maximum residue limits. Okay, so a maximum residue limit is what it is it's the maximum amount of a veterinary drug that is allowed in food of animal origin. So in the EU we have legislation, Regulation 470/2009, which specifically sets out the framework for the evaluation and the establishment of maximum residue limits. And once a maximum residue limit for a substance is established, the substance and the relevant values are included in a list, and this list is itself part of a second piece of legislation, Regulation 37/2010. And at this point, that piece of regulation includes, I don't know, somewhere around 850 substances. So the purpose of maximum residue limits is primarily to ensure consumer safety, to ensure that consumers aren't exposed to excessive amounts of residues of veterinary drugs, But there is also a secondary impact, and that is the fact that these values are relevant for trade, because the values included in the list are enforceable EU standards, and so when animal produce is imported from a third country into the EU, the levels of residues in the food of animal origin have to comply with the EU standards. So, when a company wants to obtain a marketing authorization for a product for food-producing animals, and that product contains a pharmacologically active substance that isn't, or for which there is not already an MRL established, it has to follow a two-step process. And the first step is to have maximum residue limits established. And this is a separate procedure to the marketing authorization procedure. It's a standalone procedure, and all applications for the establishment of MRLs come in to the EMA, and the evaluation is undertaken by our scientific committee, the CVMP. And then when the CVMP reaches an opinion, it makes a recommendation to the European Commission, and the Commission, in consultation with the EU member states, decides whether to adopt then those maximum residue limits. And in the vast majority of cases, the MRLs go through as proposed by CVMP. And these are then published in that piece of legislation, Regulation 37/2010, that I mentioned before. So then once the MRLs are established, the company can then go forward to register its product. And part of the dossier that the company has to submit for the authorization of the product will include a section that aims to demonstrate that the withdrawal period, that is to say, the time between administration of the product and the time at which the animal is slaughtered, or milk or eggs are taken for human consumption, that during that interval there will have been sufficient depletion of the pharmacologically active substances to the level of the MRL or below. And then in addition, in the EU there is a residue monitoring program, and that is run by the member states, but they undertake monitoring activities to ensure that in the field the MRL values are indeed complied with, and it alerts the authorities if there are values that are non-compliant, and if there could be issues with misuse of the product, or if the withdrawal periods are inadequate. So just to say a few words about the dossier that needs to be provided for the evaluation of maximum residue limits. The dossier consists of two main parts, a safety section and a residues section. In the safety section, the focus is primarily on laboratory animal tests, so typical toxicology tests, but in addition, tests on pharmacological effects and also on biological, microbiological effects that could be relevant for effects on the human gut flora. And looking at these data, the CVMP derives an acceptable daily intake, which is an estimate of the amount of the residues that can be ingested daily over a lifetime without appreciable health risk to the exposed individuals. And then the second part of the dossier is the residues section, and this focuses on pharmacokinetics and in particular residue depletion studies, and also includes analytical methods. So the aim here is to look at the depletion profile of the residues in the tissues or milk or eggs, and to identify the time after administration of the product at which the overall residue burden to which a consumer would be exposed falls below the acceptable daily intake. And then in this way the MRLs can be established to ensure that the ADI is not exceeded. The analytical methods are needed because, as I mentioned, there's a residue monitoring program, so the applicant has to demonstrate that methods are available that would allow monitoring of residues in the field. And it's worth highlighting that the guidelines that are used both for the safety and the residue tests are internationally harmonized guidance, so they're VICH guidance, and so these same guidelines are applied in many regions of the globe. So that was a quick roundup, quick summary of MRLs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for that introduction. So that's a whole area of work that companies seeking to make products for food-producing species have to do, which is over and above what's necessary for human dossiers. And you can see some of the work that needs to go into that. So any questions on that around the... Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so my name is Zuma. I'm from Zambia. The withdrawal periods, do you have standard withdrawal periods for specific tissue? So let's say for this product, for meat is so many days, for milk is so many days, for chicken is for eggs is so many days. And if so, is there a place where the way you have in the regulation those 850 substances, could you also have some sort of a database that has recommended withdrawal periods for specific tissue?
The approach taken is that the withdrawal periods are actually product specific. So the exception to that is for those substances which have been considered not to represent a hazard for the consumer. So for substances that are considered to be very safe, then the entry in that list is what we call a no MRL required entry. So that means that there's no numerical value was considered necessary. For products containing those substances, the expectation would be that there would be a 0-day withdrawal period generally. Then for the other substances for which there are numerical values established, then for each product there has to be a study to demonstrate that what withdrawal period would be appropriate, because formulation is considered to be an influencing factor, and that has to be taken into account. So we don't have standard withdrawal periods. The only exception that I could mention is when products are used off-label, so they're used what we call under the cascade, so a product that's authorized, say, for cattle is used in another species, and then there is legislation, well, in our legislation there are certain days which are minimum withdrawal periods, but it's up to the veterinarian to actually make a recommendation on an appropriate withdrawal period, but there are minimum values that would apply.
Okay, could we follow that up later on, do you think? Because I think it's we could be here a long time, and we're in a bit of a rush. Okay, so I think what we'll do, and we'll certainly pick up those questions later, to be delighted to answer them. We're going to ask Julia Fabrega-Clement, who's now going to talk about environmental risk assessment. And again, that in itself is a big topic. So Julia's going to focus on those areas that are different, really, between human and veterinary and the overall approach on veterinary medicines.
Yes, thank you very much. So as David said, well, first I'll introduce myself. My name is Julia, and I work also the veterinary division in the sector of veterinary pharmaceuticals. I've been in the agency for a bit over 3 years and always involved in issues related to the environmental risk assessment. I think that you haven't covered in a lot of detail this area for human medicines. Not at all. Okay, so everything.
Sorry. You're the first one.
So I'll make it interesting. Let's see. So, right. So Basically, look at my notes. In the EU, the environmental risk assessment for veterinary medicinal products is conducted in line with or in accordance with the ICH guidelines, which are internationally harmonized guidelines. However, the Committee for Veterinary Medicines have developed also a number of guidelines that add additional guidance or technical support to the ICH guidelines. In the EU, the environmental risk assessment is mandatory for all applications. That means that it's necessary to have it for a new veterinary medicinal product, but also for generic products. Typically, the risk assessment is conducted in two phases, phase 1 and phase 2, but I'll cover that in my next slide, so I won't say much more in here. What's important to bear in mind is that if following a full environmental risk assessment, the risk for the environment cannot be totally ruled out, and the possibility to use risk mitigation measure has been explored, and none of the mitigation measures can guarantee to control environmental risks, then this environmental risk will be factored in within the benefit-risk balance of the product, keeping in mind that there is the possibility that high environmental risks can lead to the non-authorization of a veterinary medicinal product. And this is slightly different than it is for human medicines. So my second slide just wants to show a schematic representation of how the risk assessment is conducted. Basically, as I say, there are two phases, 1 and 2, but there are a lot of stop points. So basically, the phase 1 is mandatory for all applications, but whether the applicants have to move to phase 2 depends on the outcome of phase 1. And also within phase 2, there are two stop points, phase 2A and then phase 2B. So it really depends on whether the applicant can indicate at the earlier stage that the environmental hazards, let's say, of the use of a veterinary medicinal product can be controlled or not, or they need more data. So for instance, for phase 1, the aim of phase 1 is basically to filter out all those products that have a limited environmental exposure, because it's basically assumed that if a product has a limited use or a very limited environmental release, it won't, sorry.
Slow down a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, I won't be too fast then. So if the environmental release is limited, there is no environmental exposure or very, very limited environmental exposure, then it's assumed that the use of that veterinary medicinal product won't cause a harm or a risk to the environment. So phase 1 is quite straightforward. However, and actually products that, for instance, fall within this category would fall within this category are products that are used for companion animals. So it's assumed that the environmental exposure is very limited, or also products that are used to treat specific conditions in a very limited number of animals within a flock or a herd. Then it's also assumed that the environmental release will be very limited, so they won't cause harm. So the assessment can stop. If, however, the outcome of phase 1 is that we cannot conclude that exposure is minimal and that environmental risks are likely, then the applicant has to move to phase 2. And that is a more robust and comprehensive risk assessment where they have to provide a significant amount of toxicity or ecotoxicity data, as well as data on exposure, and basically do a better characterization of the potential risks. And at that stage, as well, is when they have to consider if there are any measures that should be put into place to minimize the environmental exposure. And so in my last slide, I'll make it a bit interactive in a way, and I just wanted to highlight a couple of interesting examples. So let's say there is a veterinary, and keeping in mind the risk assessment with the two phases that I just mentioned. So let's say that we have a product that's used for piglets. So a very straight phase 1 assessment would be that we can use metabolism data to look at how much of the product is excreted via feces and urine, so it ends up in manure. So in most European countries, manure is used to fertilize agricultural fields. So that process is also a vector for pharmaceuticals to end up in the environment. So the applicant has to take this into account and predict what is the concentration that will end up in agricultural fields from the treatment of animals with that product. If the concentration is predicted to be less than 100 micrograms per kilogram, then the guideline says that that's safe. So the applicant can stop and can conclude that the use of the product in that particular group of animals won't cause a risk for the environment. However, here on the other hand, if the concentration was above 100 milligrams per kilogram, then the applicant would require to do additional tests to ensure that a higher concentration will not be harmful to local communities of organisms living in where the animals will be treated, let's say. But here I'll introduce the first interesting example, and it is that there are situations where the environmental concentration might be below the trigger value noted in the guideline, but you might have, or the applicant might have, let's say, additional data that indicates that that particular substance has a different mode of action or it can be toxic at low concentrations. And in that particular case, requesting a phase 2 assessment, so requesting a better characterized risk assessment, can be justified. And this is the case, for instance, for substances that may have endocrine disrupting properties, which may target local communities of fish and so on. So in this particular situation, you can ask for a phase 2 risk assessment. And then if we will move back to a phase 2 assessment, I'll just click the whole way. But here I wanted to use an example of a product that was discussed a few months ago at the Veterinary Committee. And this was a zinc-based product that was used also to treat piglets for diarrhea. And basically, let's say that the exposure scenario was the same as I just described. So piglets were treated, and the manure was incorporated into agricultural fields. So basically, the assessment concluded that actually the amount of zinc being accumulated in agricultural fields would eventually exceed safe concentrations because zinc is inorganic, there was no degradation. And basically, the committee, the scientific committee, was asked to consider if there were any risk mitigation measures that could guarantee that this gradual accumulation would not be detrimental longer term. However, there were no risk mitigation measures considered efficient enough to control such risk. And in that situation, the committee was asked to consider environmental risk within the benefit-risk balance of the product. And their overall opinion was that because of such risks, the product was deemed to have a negative opinion, and it was proposed that the product was withdrawn from the market in that case. So that's an example of when an environmental risk has had a significant effect. But in most other situations, I should say that applicants can investigate risk mitigation measures that allow to control the environmental risks and get the product in the market. Yes.
Yeah. Just want to draw your attention to this sort of fourth criterion. We have quality, safety, and efficacy, and we have environmental assessment and risk assessment. And it is in the human side as well. We have to do it. It's mandatory. They need to provide this information. But legally speaking, we're not allowed to refuse a marketing authorization for this reason, which is not the case, obviously, as was just demonstrated in the veterinary area. So it's a sort of contrast in between the two, which is, I think, interesting and worth highlighting.
Yeah. Thank you there, Julia. I think some useful illustration of how it works on the veterinary side, and that zinc product was a real challenge for the network because it's been used for decades in the pig industry. So to suddenly come out and say that you're going to ban it is obviously quite a controversial opinion, and the science needs to be good if you're going to do it. And I'm pleased to say it seems to have held up very well. Questions? So, good. Any questions? Did I see? Yes, I see a question. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe just a quick one on something like the zinc issue. Is it not better to then say maybe residue from these pigs treated using this should not be used to treat agricultural fields unless maybe there are other alternatives for that medicine?
Yeah, no, I think I can just say something on that. And I mean, I think, yes, those are the alternatives are considered in that case. And also, what will be the impact on animal health if that product is withdrawn? But in this case, there isn't really an alternative. When you're producing these large amounts of manure, what are you going to do with them? You have to do something, and in the end, they have to end up on the land. In most circumstances, you'd agree with that? Yeah, okay. Great. Okay. Thank you. So we're going to move on to the next topic. We've got two more to get through, and we have veterinary pharmacovigilance, and Jos Olerts is going to speak.
Thank you. Thank you, David. So my name is Jos Olerts, veterinarian, statistics by education, working at the agency since '99 and the last many years on pharmacovigilance. And I've seen from your program, tomorrow you have 1.5 hours on the pharmacovigilance on the human side. Sorry, I have to condense it in 3 slides. But it's good to hear that there's already interest from.
You're the first one.
I'm the first one, okay. And many of the specifics that you will hear will actually apply, that you will hear tomorrow will apply to us as well. But okay, so when a product goes to market on the veterinary side, theoretically we know much of the safety already because it has been used in overdose studies, also in efficacy studies, so a lot of trial data are available, but at the same time the companies have been cost effective, they have followed all the guidelines, and we know from experience that in the field really many of the products will be used outside of the narrow claim that it's on there, will often be used also in different animals, different animal groups. So there's a good reason to follow up post-authorization. That's what we do with pharmacovigilance. And what do we understand? What are the type of issues that we're following up? And adverse reactions in animals, but as well as humans that are accidentally exposed, sometimes not accidentally exposed to products. We also follow up on the lack of potentially expected efficacy, which theoretically also includes resistance on antibiotics and antiparasitics. Although the system is less used specifically for that kind of data, but theoretically that's what's included according to the guidelines. We also collect data, if available, not so much becomes available for pharmacovigilance, but if available, violations of approved residue limits and potential environmental problems. So this just for those who really want to go into depth in our regulations and the different guidelines, I've just specified them on this slide. So how do we monitor now on the EU level? So most of it is based around electronic reporting, very similar on the human side. There is a mandatory reporting by the companies of the serious reports, as we call them, the serious reactions. Within 15 days of a company becoming aware of it, it has to be going to either the member states where it occurred, and then the member states forwards it to our central EU database, or the veterinarian can also choose to go directly to the regulator, the member state report an issue, and the member state again will then forward the issue to our central EU database. The same thing applies to third country reporting. So where we have the same products and similar products on the market in third countries, they can be anywhere in the world. The companies are obliged to report the serious cases, again, within 15 days to our database. What happens to all the non-serious cases? So a compilation of all the reports, including more information about literature and so forth, will reach the regulators on a 6-monthly or a yearly basis in what's called a periodic safety update report. So the company keeps on collecting all these electronic reports and any other information that they have, and they follow a guideline that specifies how this type of information needs to be represented, and they submit it for evaluation to the regulator. Separate to that, so this is the periodic one, separate to that, we now have, since a few years, similar than on the human side, we do also signal detection. So we have the central EU database that has a collection of all the reports in the EU, but also all the reports for same and similar products outside of the EU. And we can do some limited analysis on it using the PRR, proportional ratio. It's kind of odds ratio that gives us an indication that some of the issues that we see for a product are out of line with what is in the database. And then it starts, the assessors, they can then look into those individual cases and try to establish whether there is something going on with that product that we didn't know when it was authorized, and whether then typically we need to update the product literature as a consequence. Sometimes there are more regulatory consequences, and the product could actually be withdrawn for the market if necessary. Who are the players involved in doing this kind of analysis? That's typically the rapporteur and his expert will look at the PSURs, the periodic, as well as signal detection. They will bring the issue to the Pharmacovigilance Working Party, which is a working party working under the CVMP. On the human side, you have an established scientific group, which is the PRAC. So alongside the CHMP, we have the Pharmacovigilance Working Party working like any other working party under the guidance of CVMP. So any information that has been found is significant information is being discussed at the level of the working party, and when for centrally authorized products, when it reaches decision time, it will go to CVMP. Just some practical cases, some recent ones. We had Velactis, was a product that went to market for drying off cows. So cows, high productive cows, that come to the end of their produce of milk. So they're pregnant at that moment, and then you need to give them some space. You need to give them some recuperation before they have to calve and then start the next cycle of giving milk again. And this product was a prolactin blocker. But what happened, we saw really immediately after the launch, we had 57 deaths of cows that become recumbency, so they were laying down, which is not good for cows. And some of them had to be euthanized, some of them died. And because of that evaluation that then took place, it was decided to, at this moment, to suspend the marketing authorization that was last year, and it's still suspended, and the company is looking into what they can do about it. So that's an example of pharmacovigilance data that led quite quickly after its launch to the suspension of a product. Some of you know about some social media that was going on in the last year about antiparasitics used in particularly dogs. So normally the tick and flea products that you give to your dog is healthy, but there were more and more hyped reports often in social media and Facebook. Facebook pages were dedicated to that, about really serious reactions going on for these kind of dogs, and this is still ongoing, looking at targeted review of such safety data for these type of products that we will be using in normally healthy animals, so you don't expect them to die from it, for example. This is still ongoing. And in any case, we're talking about very rare events. Okay, I'm sorry, so I didn't have time to go in any further detail, but I'm happy to, in the break, also to give you further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jos. Thank you for those illustrations as well to make it, come real as to what we do within the division with some of these products that are of obvious, importance either economically or to people in the form of their companion animals. So any questions before we move on? Yep. Thank you. It's a question. No?
Good afternoon. Jamila from Regulator on Cape Verde. I have two questions. One would be if the causality assessment used the same methodology as for human medicine. And the second question is for signal detection. In case of resistance, there usually need of lab testing. Is it done in a periodic basis or just if already there is a signal detection? Thank you.
So I'll do the first question. And now I forgot the first question.
Yeah,
sorry. Causality assessment, yes, because it's a bit complicated because causality originally started exactly the same thing, but it has evolved. On the human side, I believe you now have kind of confirmation of the signals. That's not taking place on the veterinary side. On the veterinary side, we still stick to the old way, which is the ABON code, coding, where on the report basis you try to identify whether you think that what you see, so the signals that have been put forward, whether they are possible or likely or unlikely related to the product. So it's really still on the product level. And but now with single detection, the importance of report-based assessment is getting less and less, because you try to do in single detection, you group the products and then you look at a certain symptom and you across a large number of reports. So the individual ABON codes are less important.
You do it systematically? Or?
Yeah, member states still do it systematically, report by product that because they consider when you look at the report, you should come to some kind of conclusion, so they automatically would still put their assessment there. Thank you.
And then you asked a little bit about laboratory testing in support of suspected lack of efficacy. I mean, it's something that's not obligatory, and it's not. It doesn't happen widely. I think it's generally recognised that pharmacovigilance is, on the veterinary side, is relatively poor at picking up the suspected lack of efficacy. So really, the efforts to ensure that where there is a suspicion, and the two cases is generally antimicrobial resistance or antiparasitic resistance, where possible, they're followed up with laboratory tests to confirm that. And certainly in the antimicrobials area, rather than within the pharmacovigilance, there is a lot of parallel activity around promoting responsible use that says you really must do sensitivity testing actually before you prescribe, but certainly if you're finding problems of resistance.
David, if you allow me, I think the lack of efficacy is the most difficult thing to pick up, because it's silent in a way. Yes. You don't get what you expect, but that there is not necessarily a complaint, say bad luck, it didn't work, but you're not necessarily picking it as an adverse reaction.
Okay, that's great, thanks. So I'm going to close off now. I think I've got about 5 minutes or so to finish. And I'm going to speak then about some of the work that we do in terms of antimicrobial resistance, and then just close up the session and invite any final questions. So in terms of antimicrobial resistance, I've already mentioned that several times in the context of the One Health strategy. Within the agency, we have a One Health task force, which comprises staff from across the agency and all of those parts of the agency that are involved one way or another in combating antimicrobial resistance, because I think it is probably the single biggest policy issue that's facing certainly veterinary medicines, and I also believe it's a very big one from the human medicines. So on the veterinary side, and that's what I'm talking about here, we try to condense our efforts and have our strategy defined in our CVMP strategy on antimicrobials, which you'll find on our website. And you'll see that that really focuses around this key statement in the strategy, that on the veterinary side, what we're trying to do is to balance the need for effective antimicrobials for treatment of infectious disease in animals with the need at the same time to minimize the risks both to humans and animals arising from their use, particularly due to antimicrobial resistance. So, and I think when you look at that, that's a very different strategy, a very different set of priorities on the veterinary side to what there is on the human side. Because on the human side, of course, it is to absolutely ensure you have a continuous supply of effective therapeutics for use in individual patients to treat infectious disease, and particularly infectious disease caused by multi-drug resistant organisms. We have to balance that need to treat infectious disease with animals to not cause undue risks to human health from use in the animal sector. So quite a different strategy and quite a different set of priorities, and that drives quite different activities, but we hope and we need and we do bring the two together. So what do we actually do? We authorise and maintain veterinary medicinal products. So bringing new antimicrobials onto the market, well, that's almost gone on the veterinary side because of the issues that I think most people are aware, that if you're going to bring a new antimicrobial substance onto the marketplace, Very rarely are you going to do that in the veterinary field anymore because it's nearly always going to be retained for human use. But we can repurpose existing antimicrobials. We can look at existing antimicrobials and ensure that their use, which they may have been on the market for 20 or 30 years, are they actually being used in a way that minimises the risk to human health from their use in animals? And a good example of that was colistin, which I think, as you know, has become increasingly important for treatment of multi-drug resistance in humans. And so last year there was a referral, and its use is now not banned, but severely restricted in animals, with a recommendation to use other antimicrobials wherever possible and to progressively try and eliminate the use, because there are alternatives to the use of colistin, but it can take time for systems to move from the use of one product to another. We can look at fluoroquinolones, look at third and fourth generation cephalosporins, aminoglycosides. All of these, we've done reviews of them and said, yep, okay, you can still use those in either all animals or certain types of animals, but these are the kind of safety warnings that you should have on. These are the restrictions and so on. We work within the other EU agencies, particularly ECDC and EFSA, on these opinions, where we gave an opinion last year on how to reduce the use of antimicrobials in animals. We've looked at what would be appropriate restrictions for existing antimicrobials, for new antimicrobials, for certain types. So we are very, very active and working with these other agencies. I'm going to show a couple of slides on the work that we do on antimicrobial consumption in animals, the European Surveillance for Veterinary Antimicrobials, because you can't really say if your policies are being effective in terms of overall use of antimicrobials or limiting uses of certain classes unless you actually measure what use of antimicrobials is taking place, and that's a responsibility that we do here. We develop guidance, we contribute. The latest European Commission strategy for antimicrobials has as one of its objectives to promote Europe as an area of best practice globally, and one of the ways that we do that is through contribution to the generation of guidelines by organisations such as Codex, OIE, WHO, on responsible use of veterinary antimicrobials. So in a wider context within Europe, the Commission has just published an antimicrobials action plan, and that includes some actions for us where it relates to use of medicines, and we contribute to the WHO GAP and the OIE strategy on antimicrobial resistance, because it's obviously something you can't sort in a country basis, you can't sort it in a regional basis, you have to sort it globally, otherwise you just import the problems that you may be dealing with quite effectively in your own territory. So what do we do about monitoring use of antimicrobials? We produce graphs or diagrams like this, which are very illustrative and very helpful in terms of driving policy. Basically, the darker the colour, the greater the use of antimicrobials in animals. And so what we do is collect the data on sales of antimicrobials across Europe. We normalise that for the biomass of animals within that country. And then we are able to compare, to some extent, one country with another in terms of their overall use of antimicrobials. And then it does really focus the minds of policymakers, particularly in those countries which have a high use of antimicrobials in animals, at least to say, why is that? There may be perfectly valid reasons why one country has more use than another. If you have more pigs, you tend to use more than if you've got cattle. If you have chickens, you can use more. If you have disease outbreaks, there are various reasons why you might have use one more than another, but this at least focuses, where is the problem? What should we be looking at? And likewise, we do more detailed work, and this is looking at the use of particular classes of antimicrobials within countries, as well as the overall use of antimicrobials within those countries. Inevitably, these get used as league tables, who's the good boys, who's the bad boys. That's not what we're intending to do. We produce objective data on use, but it is if one country has 10 times the amount of antimicrobial use and a similar animal population, then you've got a good question to ask, why is that? And who is the one that needs to do something about it? If the use of fluoroquinolones or third and fourth generation cephalosporins are much higher in one country than another, you need to ask, why is that, when we know that that's associated with a greater risk for man? So that's the kind of data that we produce. Where we're aiming for now is really looking at, this is overall sales data, which is a proxy of use. What we want to do is to gather data on actual use of antimicrobials per species and category of animals, but that's a very intensive work that will take quite some time to do, but it is our next target, and we're starting to work towards that, because of course then you really are able to benchmark right from the level of the farm to the level of the country, comparing like for like, and really targeting those species and animals and antimicrobials that are greatest risk. So that's just a flavour of the work that we do in terms of antimicrobials. So finally then, I hope I've shown you that we work as an integrated part of the agency, that the principles of evaluating quality, safety and efficacy are the same applied for human medicines and in veterinary medicines, but the actual practical application of those principles can be quite different. And we've talked about ERA, we've talked about MRLs, we've talked about antimicrobials. You can see we apply them quite often in a different well, and we do very definitely follow the One Health approach. Thank you.